Good afternoon. I'm Mark Carkenny, the Senior Manager for Government Initiatives with ACT-IAC. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for the fifth webinar put on by ACT-IAC's Institute for Innovation. Today's webinar will feature a discussion revolving around human-centered design. For those of you who have joined us in the past, thanks for your attendance. And for those of you who are new, welcome. The Institute for Innovation within ACT-IAC works to highlight exciting over-the-horizon innovations with the private sector and in government. As part of this mission, the Institute sponsors an annual awards event called Igniting Innovation, which will occur in May 2020. The nomination period for the event is currently open until January the 31st. We encourage anyone within the government, industry, or academic communities to submit their innovations to be considered for recognition. More information about how to nominate can be found on the ACT-IAC website. In addition to presenting during today's webinar, ICF is one of the supporters of our awards program. We are thankful for their contributions and support. The Institute is proud to sponsor this webinar, and we look forward to highlighting human-centered design and other innovations in upcoming webinars. So please stay tuned for more information on that. All right. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you all to feel free to submit questions during the presentation using the Q&A box on your screen. We will make time at the end to address many questions as we have time for. With all that said, I'd like to turn the discussion over to Kyle Tuberson from ICF.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, so I'm Kyle Tuberson. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for ICF and excited for this fifth webinar of the year here. We've had a number of technology-focused webinars in our first set of series of this webinar series. But today we're focusing on human-centered design, so it'll be an interesting and an important pivot from what we've done in the past. So as I said, today we're talking about human-centered design and its role in improving customer experience measures in government. We have Mike Amante, a customer experience lead for the GSA Centers of Excellence, and Wendy Harmon, a customer experience strategist for ICF. Mike and Wendy have been working closely together at HUD for the last year, and we're excited to have them present today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Wendy.
Thanks, Kyle. And thanks for everyone who's joined the webinar today. I'm going to turn it over to Mike Amante to introduce himself really quickly and tell you a little bit more about himself.
Sure. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks all for joining. Looking forward to the discussion. So my name is Mike Amante. I work at GSA. I'm CX lead at the Centers of Excellence and currently have been working on the partnership between GSA and Housing and Urban Development. Prior to that, just to give you a little bit of my background, spent quite a few years in private sector, started my career as a product developer in the medical field, and then kind of evolved from there into developing new products and services across a number of industries that enhance the relationships between organizations and the customers they serve. Excited to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And my name is Wendy Harmon. As Kyle mentioned, I am an experience strategist for ICF and have been working on the GSA Centers of Excellence Customer Experience Phase 1 teams for the last about year and a half. And we have been very lucky to work with Mike over the last year of that. Before I joined ICF in this project, I was a Presidential Innovation Fellow and worked for a number of federal agencies doing human-centered design on some pretty intractable problems that we have. And before that, I spent about a decade at the Red Cross doing all kinds of technology, communications, engagement, experience kinds of stuff, including building a digital command center for emergency response. So with that, we will try to find out a little bit about you all. I think we were just curious to know who's joined us today. So if you see a description here that fits you, please pick it in the next couple of seconds, and otherwise can choose the other, and we'll figure out how to tailor what we're going to talk about today based on this a little bit. right, should I? Okay, so here's our results. It looks like we have a little bit of everybody in here, but quite a few CX consultants. So you'll probably already be familiar with a bunch of the concepts that we're talking about today. And I should mention that we are, move forward one here. When we talk about customer experience, this is generally a place where that's growing within the federal space and where you hear and see and use human-centered design quite a bit. That doesn't mean that human-centered design can't be used in every single aspect of any kind of operations or approach. What it really is an approach to problem solving using the viewpoint of the person that you're trying to serve first. So the way that we're describing it today is the sum of how people think and feel and act about your agency in the context of what they're trying to achieve. And when we talk about customer experience, we're really talking about creating a positive experience. And that means that you're building products, which are like technology solutions, platforms, and services, which are more closely tied to like policy making and program design that matter to the people that you serve. And the underlying method to customer experience is human-centered design. And it's really more of a way of life and a structured way to be creative and a method for learning about your customers. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about what's happening with customer experience across the federal space. And there's quite a bit of momentum for using human-centered design to improve customer experiences. First, the White House has made customer experience a priority. It's a CAP goal, cross-agency priority goal, on the President's management agenda. OMB is operationalizing customer experience. They have issued OMB A11 Section 280, which now rolls off my tongue quite easily, even though it probably shouldn't. That provides requirements for measuring customer satisfaction and is quite prescriptive about how an agency can begin to, and it must begin to, really evaluate the experience of its customers. There's also some legislation mandating customer experience become a focus, including the 21st Century Integrated Digital Experience Act. And there's a bunch of activity within federal agencies where they're establishing customer experience offices, including the VA and USDA and several others there. The government also is growing some support services that help to accelerate CX. So there's quite a few sort of internally incubated programs that are happening that help different federal agencies really accelerate this idea of using human-centered design. The Centers of Excellence, the OPM Lab, and some other GSA-related programs like the PIPs and 18F. So really, all this stuff is going on, and it's really important to be aware of. My own personal opinion is that this is a very government-y approach to embracing human-centered design. Setting up these publicly reported measures is all really great, but the real way to improve the customer experience in all these measures means that there has to be a pretty significant shift to some new approaches, including human-centered design methodologies, to operations and problem solving, and that those focus on outcomes for the public, for citizens, and all the intermediaries that the government serves, and partners that the government serves. So lots of people will ask us about the ROI of using human-centered design, and in the government space, it's really to increase effectiveness, trust in the government. We have been ever-evolving customer expectations in all of our lives. Our expectations change, and that's in large part due to rapidly evolving technologies as well. And so in order for the government to keep up and maintain trust that in these experiences and in dealing with federal agencies, human-centered design can really come in handy as a tool and methodology for accomplishing that. So, Mike, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, actually, and we can move into the next slide, but trust is at the core, right? Why is all this activity happening? As Wendy said, ultimately, the government, and it's heartening to me and should be to you and probably is to you, that the government's really interested in very real ways in enhancing the relationships between itself and those who they serve. And the core of any relationship is trust. That's kind of the foundation. And so that trust, ultimately, I'll move to the next slide, is built on understanding. So what we're going to go over today, obviously we could talk, I'm sure many of you could talk for days and days on the topic, but what we wanted to lay out is based on our joint experience, and I should say, I worked with Wendy, and she's one of the most brilliant folks I've worked with in this area, and want to lay out kind of the three basic steps to kind of how do we understand how to build that foundation of trust in the unique position that a lot of government agencies are in. And there's three steps we're going to go over. Ultimately, first, consider your customers. I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but it's simply just think about them. Think about them often and think about them in a very real way. The second is understand your customers. So not just consider them, which is the first step, which is a mindset shift, consider them, but now that I'm considering them, how do I really understand them and put all of my pre-existing assumptions and presuppositions aside when I'm attempting to understand them? So I'm getting to know them really well. And finally, experiment with them. So listen to them, respond to them, and see how those responses work for them. This is pretty basic stuff, but it's the core of what we're talking about here. So Wendy, of course, you'll dive in if you want to add anything on these slides, but I'll start hitting on a couple of these points. So starting with the first one, when we say consider your customer, what are we talking about? What we're talking about simply is doing everything from a customer-first perspective. And that means adopting a new mindset. And that new mindset is one where the first question that should naturally come to mind as human beings serving other human beings is, who are my customers and what's going to matter to them most? So that's simple. And again, assuming I don't know the answer to that. Even if I've been in this 35 years, even if I spend every week out in the field talking to customers or meeting with some kind of intermediary, just kind of taking a very genuine, objective perspective of I'm always going to ask myself, who are they? And I'm always going to remind myself what matters to them. And so to kind of bring this to life a little bit, we'll use a framework in a little bit that you've seen, I'm sure, but in a different way. So jump into the next slide. Right, traditionally, a traditional approach to problem solving that I think comes naturally for a lot of people is to consider two things. And forgive the words here, but to start from either one of two vantage points and consider these two things. Number one on the left, start by thinking about my organization, right? Look, I got to change some things here. I want to be more efficient. I want to change how we operate. So I'm going to start by asking myself, how can I improve the viability of what I'm doing here? How can I be more efficient? How can I increase returns? How can I hit whatever metric I'm supposed to hit and be better at doing that? That's a perfectly reasonable starting point, of course. Or the starting point might be, or in parallel, it might be, how can I feasibly advance my organization? How can I do the latest things, bring in the latest technology, advance my systems? I've kind of got legacy systems here. Innovate, in quotes. And the traditional approach finds a lot of value at the intersection of these two things. So outside of government, right, you could generate a lot of profit by just thinking about these two things. You really can. And you could generate some incremental growth that will ultimately get you more money in the bank. In government, certainly you can increase the efficiency of your agency. You could increase the adoption of new technologies at helping you achieve those efficiencies. But what we're talking about here is one step further than these two factors. What we're talking about here is adding a third factor and considering this third factor first. And so it's not just the business and tech, but there's a people consideration. So the first thing you ask yourself, like we said earlier, is who are my customers and what changes will matter most to them? And then once I answer that, if I'm always starting there, then I think about business and tech or business and my feasibility in a slightly different way. I then can move on to say, okay, now that I know that, now that I really understand the people I'm trying to serve, now that I understand what matters to them, and by the way, you can include in there employees, what matters to my employees as well, now I can ask myself, okay, how can we do that while achieving our effectiveness goals? How can we do that bringing, with the resources we have, bringing resources to the table to support that? On the tech and feasibility side, what technology makes sense, right, given the desired outcomes? What technologies and applications make sense given the realities of what my organization is capable of and given the realities of what kind of appetite exists here? So again, this is a framework you guys are all familiar with, but this is step one. I'm going to move to the next slide, Wendy, and then I'll let you go from there. So step two is understand them, right? So we've considered them. We're asking that question first. But now it's, okay, I'm thinking about it. How do I really get to know them? And an important factor here is there's two sides to every human being. Well, there's many more sides, but just simply, people have functional needs, people have emotional needs. And those two things don't exist discretely, right? I can't, unfortunately, as rational as I think I am, separate my functional requirements from my emotional reactions. It's just not very human thing to do. On the functional side, what are folks trying to achieve? How are they behaving in seeking that out? On the emotional side, what do they value? How do their behaviors mesh with those values or not? What do they aspire to do? And ultimately, what we're trying to get to here in that understanding is understand not only what matters to them, but why it matters. Understand why they're reacting to certain elements of our interaction in a certain way, not just what their interaction is. So do they hate it when they call us up? Do they wish that would be a little bit better? Yeah, that's part of it, but why? Why do they hate it? Why do they wish that would be a little bit better? Both sides of those coins are critical to this approach. Wendy, I turn it back to you for this example to bring that to life.
Yeah, so we wanted to share a fun example of how important it is to actually go out and speak with the human beings who are interacting with your services and your programs. And this example, to my mind, does this better than most. So here's a Japanese-based car-sharing company, and they're in business, right? So they're asking themselves all the time, how do we get more customers to take more trips with this car-sharing business model? And so they might have a quantitative, like, data dashboard that they look at monthly or every 2 months. It might look something like this, right? There's a bunch of data here, and I love this. Like, I'm secretly a pretty big data nerd, right? But this is terrific quantitative data that tells you a lot. Like, you could dive into any one of these cells on this sheet here and come up with some insights about your customer's behavior based on this report. But one thing that they found pretty interesting, if you look at the blue highlighted area, is that there are 4,600 trips being taken that go 0 miles. So that being like a curious data point to this company, they thought, well, let's go out and talk to people and figure out the people who didn't go anywhere and figure out why they didn't go anywhere. And so what they found when they underwent that qualitative research, so that's what we mean when we say qualitative research. It's actually going and speaking one-on-one or doing ethnography and a number of other methods to really get into the shoes and the minds of the people who are using your services. And they figured out, here are 3 quotes from people. I rented the car to eat a boxed meal. I thought that I bought at a convenience store because I couldn't find anywhere else to have lunch. Second one, usually the only place I can take a nap while visiting my clients is in a cyber cafe in front of the station, but renting a car to sleep in is just a few hundred yen, almost the same as staying in the cyber cafe. And the third person said, another person stored bags, or it's not a quote, sorry, another person stored their bags and other personal belongings. They used it like a locker in the rental car when the nearby coin lockers were full. And so these are really interesting, this is really interesting feedback and really interesting observation. And so one of the things that you want to do when you get to this point is that you've got all of these operations, and a lot of people will stop here and say, okay, well, we see that people are using this to nap, so that must mean we should make short-term costs available and create a business out of that, right? But what we're suggesting is taking the aggregate of these observations and really looking at what matters about the aggregation of this information, the sum of this information. And that gets you back to that functional and emotional need, those motivating behaviors and drivers, and the problems that this group of people is actually trying to solve. And so what that ends up being is that people are seeking temporary ways to alleviate the everyday burdens of city life. So it may be that it's a great idea to open like a small room hotel, but until you really get to that fundamental driving insight about this phenomenon, you probably are going to be on, it's not the right path, or it's not the wrong path, at least a little bit of an ill-informed path in creating and building and designing those products and services. And so back to one of the things that Mike said before about really assuming that you don't know anything about your customers, I'll tell you another brief example. I was with a client yesterday who we're talking about conducting a little bit of customer research, and they said, well, we already know who these people are very well. We've been working with them for years. So you can actually just skip that part because we can stand in for them. And the entire point of doing human-centered design is to suspend your assumed knowledge about this group of people and really talk to them and get to the heart of finding out what makes them tick, both functionally and emotionally. And I think, Mike, I'll turn it over to you to add to that story. You're the insight king, so I'd love to hear some thoughts.
I'm not at all. I think this is a really nice example Wendy's presented on the power of quantitative and qualitative working together to give you that what and why, what matters and why it matters. And I think if you just look at this slide that's up here, right, and I'm sure many of you could point to many different examples, and you just had what was on the left side. You just had the data table that we saw earlier, and ultimately you said, okay, some people are using cars, they're not going anywhere. Some people are napping. People are temporarily. I'm sorry, if you just had the table, you wouldn't even know this. If you did the qualitative and you just looked at these observations one-on-one, people are napping, people are storing things in the car, people are using their cars for a quiet place to eat a meal, you'd come up with certain ideas to address this, right? These ideas might be organizational, and they might be customer-focused. They might be, oh my gosh, let's take engines out of 20% of our cars. I don't know, right? Like, that's an awful idea. But there could be ideas you come up with, even with the quant and qual together. When you take the time to consider the quant and qual and all the points of connection, like Wendy's saying, that where all of these pieces of information connect to each other in relevant ways, and you start uncovering, oh my gosh, there's some kind of center of gravity here, and you read what's on the right, the ideas you come up with, and you can just do it as a mental exercise, when you read, people are feeling squeezed. They have few available affordable options to relieve the pressure of living in Tokyo. The basic necessities of life, like taking a nap, having a place to sit without rubbing elbows with a stranger, they become rarities. So much so that people are finding creative ways to escape, including renting our cars and not going anywhere. I personally, the ideas I come up with on the right are way different than the ideas I come up with on the left. There's some overlap. And it's because of that rich, nuanced understanding of the what and why and weaving it together and taking the time to really weave it together, I think is what we're talking about here. And when we say understanding, it's as deep as possible understanding in a narrative form, because that's how people exist. They exist, well, I don't know if they exist in narratives, but they don't exist as bullet points for sure. And so I love this example, but I'll keep moving. It's so I'll just acknowledge this, even though it's completely awkward presenting to a silent group on the internet. But thanks for your Q&A. Keep them coming. Okay. So the last element, and we're not going to go into a ton of detail here, is experiment with customers, right? So you're considering them, so you've shifted your mindset. You understand them, and you're getting deep into their world in as unbiased a way as possible. Now it's time to do something that makes their lives different. And the best way to do anything and de-risk anything is to do it. And so we have this quote, "Doing is the best kind of thinking." It's something we read. But the point is that you have to actually do it. You actually try something, and you have to get it back in front of those same people who you're trying to understand and develop that intimate, trusting relationship with to see if you got it right. And the only way to do it is to experiment. It's not to debate in large rooms with a lot of people about all the challenges of going full scale, all the reasons we shouldn't do it. It's finding opportunities to carve out little things that you can try. So this requires a new mindset. I mean, look, I'm not completely naive. There's a lot of risk to putting anything out there publicly, right? But if you could find even just small ways to experiment and get folks to give you feedback, the likelihood that we will deliver against what matters most to our most important customers goes way up. And the level of investment that we use goes way down. And so we firmly believe in this approach. We could spend another whole session talking about how to experiment with customers, and as I'm sure many of you could. But that is the third point. So, and I hope that resonates with you guys. And so before we kind of close it out, just to reiterate, right, it's basically three simple steps that we're talking about. It's considering customers, understanding customers, and experimenting with customers. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to us. Wendy, do you have anything to add before we go to questions?
Yeah, I think those three items feel really simple when we use these words to describe them, and yet they signify three shifts for the way most federal agencies operate. So the first one is really having that operational viewpoint and mindset to be customer-centered, to think first about the customer in every kind of development of technology, policy, and program. The second one is talking with customers. So I think still when you're out in the federal space today, there's quite a bit of reluctance to actually allow anybody within the agency to go and talk with the folks who are using their services about those services and get their feedback in those really deep ways. And so building the pathways and allowing for agencies to have the freedom to have this relationship building and to be able to go out and talk is also a shift. And I think the third one is this experimenting. I love the way Mike says the best way to de-risk an idea or a project is to try it. And that's the way I'd love to see federal agencies thinking about experimenting and rapid prototyping and all of that kind of thing. Where in reality today, I think there's quite a lot of perceived risk in trying anything within the space today. So these are three pretty big shifts we're seeing within the federal space that I think would love to see some more of.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Mike. This is Kyle again. And so we'll jump to Q&A, and we have a number of questions online, and I'll go through a couple of those. And maybe we'll start with I like this one in particular. Most UX efforts seem to be addressed in silos, directly related to a specific project or program. Curious if a more horizontal approach that would cross over programs and better overall governance is being considered. So how do you see that?
I mean, I can answer by.
Yep.
You want to do it? I mean, I would just say I think that everyone who's sort of working in this space, and I think that's probably most all of us on this webinar, is that we have to keep advocating and actually talking with each other about the true needs and the shifts that need to happen within government to make it work better, to improve customer experience, right? And so I think it's fine to have siloed, smaller UX efforts. Human-centered design works very well in those environments, and I think broader strategic human-centered design and focus, like we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes, is also really important for the government to be looking at. So that would be my answer. What would you say, Mike?
Yeah, I think it's critical. I think that based on my experience, a lot of agencies and departments looking at this, one of the critical first steps they take is to relook at and remap all of the programs and services they offer through a customer lens. So instead of thinking, yes, we have to operate in silos as an organization, absolutely, that's essential for running a company or an organization. But taking a lot of these agencies are looking at how would we be reorganized if we were organized based on what citizens need or how they experience us. And that's a critical first step to really understanding how we bring the organization and the citizen and the intermediary closer together. That exists across silos.
I would also say I have a theory that I think the way that most federal agencies are organized today came up in a pre-digital era when silos actually worked for the way operations had to be organized, right? So it benefited the agency to have silos. And today, with the way we can share data and do everything else with technology, those silos are no longer doing us any favors. And so it's this slow shift to breaking down individual departments. And I would argue the best way of looking at how to do that is to take a customer-centered approach.
Great, thank you. There's another question around experimentation, and I'm a huge fan of experimentation. But the question is really around what is the best way to initiate the experimentation process, if you will?
Mike?
The best way to initiate the experimentation process?
Yes.
I think if I'm understanding it correctly, I think the best thing to do is when you get to the point where, so let me answer this in a couple of different ways. You get to the point where you have an idea that you have pretty high confidence will make a difference. You have a pretty decent confidence that the organization can get it done somehow, right? You've already, hopefully, with some sponsors and executives, built excitement around that, right? So that's a given when you're going to then say, okay, we're going to experiment. At least enough excitement to let you experiment. Then I would say what you have to do is figure out the version of that thing that you can build in some prototyped way fast, and the version of the test that you can do, given the environment of government, PRA rules, and everything else, quickly. Because I think experimentation is obviously a repetitive process. You want to get V1 or V0.1 done quickly, and you want to get some results fast. And so if that means starting with testing it with field employees, people closest to customers, or just testing it with 5 customers for whatever reason, and it's not a designed thing. It's actually just something that's pretty basic on paper or something they can react to quickly in a survey or online digitally. You got to start getting responses of any kind. I'm not saying low quality, but of any kind very quickly once you got that excitement, because you need to leverage that excitement into some tangible results, because that'll get you the next round of experimentation. Wendy, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I love the low fidelity approach, and it can even be, I mean, not secret, but like just getting an idea in front of someone. The main point of being able to do that is that you avoid spending millions of dollars developing a tool that turns out to be not quite the right solution. And so the whole point is to put in front of people, well, what is this going to look like? What is this going to feel like? And even if you're doing it with pieces of paper, it works really well. I think the heart of the question is that I think we all have to work together to say this is a really important thing for our government to be able to do, and let's figure out the pathways that allow us to do it.
Great, thank you. So here's another one. You know, one of the related to the 3 pillars of the president's management agenda around IT modernization in particular, with a lot of projects being initiated to modernize legacy technology. What's the best way to go from a mindset of human-centered design to operationalize it within a software development lifecycle? So how do you see it plugging into an SDLC?
I mean, I think the customer research sort of has to come first, in making the case that understanding that we want to build the exact right solution based on true, validated, data-driven customer needs is sort of the longer before the process that I would advocate for happening. And then, just as we've been sort of talking about through the presentation, it's checking back with those customers at every single step along the way of the development cycle to say, yes, does this work? Is this and getting validation through that process. And then, of course, at launch, being open to never having a final version, right? Like continuously collecting that feedback and building that backlog of features. Anything to add there, Mike?
Nope, you nailed it.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it ties back to the experimentation question before at the beginning of any modernization effort. You want to test some things early. So I think those are definitely kind of correlated. Here's another good one around information sharing. So you have examples of defining the customer experience within federal agencies. And the second part to that, are there any templates for collecting the information you would need to build out the customer experience?
So defining it is a key challenge. I think Mike and I and several other people who are on the webinar now who have been working with us for the last year can probably talk to you for a whole nother hour, if not longer, just about this process in really ingraining and figuring out how to put the opportunity and get the client into the mindset of really wanting to be customer-centered and figuring out what is our definition of customer, who are the customers of this agency or program or whoever you're dealing with. I think it can be really broad. I saw another question in there that might be somewhat related. How do you move this from a technology-only CIO shop discussion to more of an operational business need discussion? And I think it happens, all along the way, depending on where you enter the relationship, right? So I'll let Mike talk and we'll see where we're at.
You're nailing it, Wendy. I don't need to. I feel like I'm going to repeat you, honestly.
Well, how about this then? We'll jump to another question. I think related.
No, I'm sorry. Let me do add to that. So, I mean, if you're looking for specific examples, right, that are publicly available, we hinted at some of the work that Wendy's been involved with, and through the COEs on the COE website. Is specifically the work that we did at USDA and that we did and are doing with HUD. I think serve as some good examples, and there are others, of course, but where that information, that process is described, the information that was gathered is shared, and as well as the results. And I think that's a good starting point. In terms of a template for like gathering the information, I think there's a lot out there. And that's like a can of worms, but I'd say let me do this, actually. The first thing you need to do when you want to gather any information from customers is think about what are the top 3 to 5 objectives you have in interacting with them, in learning from them. So what are your goals? What are your 3 to 5 goals? And yes, that sounds cheesy. It is a critical step. That if you were to say, tell me one thing to do, I'd say think about your learning goals, your research goals, and 3 to 5, and go from broad to narrow, and go from emotional to functional. And if you spend the time to really do that, that will give you a framework for any data collecting you want to do, and it'll give you a framework for analysis as well.
Okay. Terrific. Very helpful. All right, so here's another one that I'm going to give you a second to think about, but, can you provide 3 really good prompting questions that could be used to elicit information from customers?
I saw that question. I was hoping you weren't going to pull that one out.
There's some tough questions.
Yeah, it's a tough question because anything I say is going to sound really generic. But along the route of what I was saying earlier, it's important to go. So I'll give a background and then I'll attempt to give 3. Is the reason I say go broad to narrow and go emotional to functional is what you're looking for, again, is what matters and why. And you discover that mostly by discovering points of tension or points of alignment between what people value and what they need. Okay, so all of that was like a lot of words, I'm sorry. So in other words, if you can have a question, so let's just use a weird example. It's about meal preparation. And you could start the conversation broadly by first understanding what role does food play in your family's life, or something like that. That will give you really good contextual understanding for how they think about the topic you're talking about and how that connects to their values. And you could follow on to that conversation. If you then went through and said, now I've got that background understanding, you could say, what are the various, so then you kind of need to understand the context. What are they doing to satisfy that? So what are the various options you go to deliver on that, like to provide that for your family, provide that role of food for your family? This is awful, guys, because I would normally take like at least a week to think about this. And so if you get that grounding understanding of what they value and why, you understand what they're doing today, and then you could start getting into questions that are a lot more detailed about, you might go out to dinner with them at a restaurant with their kids. You might observe what it's like to take kids to Chili's, as an example. You might ask them very pointed questions about, well, why'd you order that? Wait, you ordered the kids' food first. Do you always do that? Why'd you do that? And then when you get those kind of 3 levels of information, you'll have what you need to start. Wendy, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that was an awesome example. I would just add a little bit of context in the actual application of doing this in the federal space. I keep calling it space like we've been in a rocket ship. Is like, well, wait, we paid you this money to come in here and do this. Why are you asking such simple, stupid questions? And so that's another point of really introducing the methods of getting to those functional and emotional needs and really understanding your customers, is that it does, in those first few questions, sometimes feel like, well, of course you already know the answer to that. Why would you spend time asking it? And it's because you're trying to understand those base feelings that the person has.
Yeah, and I'm going to add on to that with, if you don't mind, with another, there was just a question that popped up on customer needs change. How often is data reviewed? So this is a good time to bring this up. Absolutely correct. Customers' needs, especially on the surface, do change and shift over time. Their values don't. And so that's why it's really important to get an understanding of both, number one, because you want to start thinking below the surface of what they're saying, below the surface of how they're acting. That's critical to this process to build solutions that are a bit more enduring than 1 to 2 years. The same token, it is really important to, not everything we do in this world is going to be one-on-one conversations. So if you have that foundational understanding, you need to be constantly checking it, constantly getting feedback on everything you do with them, every interaction you have with them, constantly scouring the world of information, passive information, to understand what they're saying about you and how they're feeling about you and why. So it is a constant cadence of understanding, but if you build good foundational understanding that includes their values, you will have a solid, enduring perspective.
That's great. That was a tough question, the three questions. So here's another one I think that, maybe where we've seen some success. Have any federal agencies deployed a user experience center, and what has been the result in terms of rate of adoption or culture change?
Yeah, I think the VA is probably so far the most mature customer experience or veteran experience office. They've got a few years under their belt of trying lots of different things and really digging in to understand who their customers are. I think there's a bunch of other agencies that are still, I hesitate to say this, but it's sort of like being a pioneer still in diapers, right? Like, this is a very nascent area of figuring out, Mike's probably rolling his eyes at me now, really figuring out what does this look like for a federal agency? How do we build the capacity and capability? Because providing and creating good customer experience and using human-centered design and really operating within a customer-centered mindset is everybody's job, right? So how do you have a centralized capability that allows you to really break down some of those program-related silos while still spreading the ability and agency and responsibility of operating in this way to every single staff member? I think I don't think that I haven't personally seen any agency that has reached that pinnacle, like, this is it. This is the way we're doing. But aren't we all always trying to just improve ourselves? Maybe there is no end pinnacle. But Mike probably has more to say about that.
Yeah, I think there's the formal ways we see it across various agencies, GSA, the ones Wendy's mentioned. But I think you see it with just when you spend one-on-one time with folks in government, right? All the people a vast majority of people who work in government because they believe in the mission of what is happening here and because they want to serve individuals and communities and make differences. And so I'd say that the core of CX is very alive and very active everywhere in government. The way of harnessing that, of formalizing that, of crossing the silos, as we were talking about before, by, I don't want to call it centralizing it, but by thinking holistically, by putting the power behind that, by putting getting decision makers on board. That's the work that's being done, but the raw material is there everywhere.
Terrific. I guess related to that then, who really should do CX in an agency, and what is the optimal reporting structure inside of an agency?
What do you think, Mike?
Are you recording this? That's like a loaded. Everyone, but you do need support from above, forgive the terminology. You do need leadership that actively support this. And you also need some mechanisms that bring people thinking ideas, investments, and resources together across the silos of the organization. So I don't want to say you need a centralized capability, but you need a mechanism to bring things together toward one kind of common objective, one common goal, one common roadmap. So it kind of exists on multiple levels, but everybody has to do it, right? So if there's a core capability that does knit everything together, but the organization doesn't believe in it, they're not empowered, they don't want to act on it, nothing will happen. If everybody wants to act on it, but they don't have the support or that aggregated knowledge, then nothing will happen.
Terrific. That was a great answer. And I think what we'll do is we'll conclude with that. And so what I'd like to do is thank you, and Mike, thank you and Wendy for presenting this content today. It was a nice pivot and change in direction in this webinar series. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark to kind of conclude.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us, and thank Wendy and Mike for their wonderful presentation today. And I know there was a number of questions in the queue about the availability of the slides and the presentation. We will be making all of that available on our ACT-IAC website. For those of you who are not familiar with us, it's actiac.org, and on our ACT-IAC YouTube channel. And please stay abreast of any of our updates. We'll have more webinars here in the future. And a friendly reminder also that the Igniting Innovation nomination period is open until January the 31st. And thank you all for joining us today. Bye.